Bill Potter. I have the privilege of directing the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. I also serve as the Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar Chair of Nonproliferation at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. So let me introduce our speakers today for a webinar dealing with recasting the geopolitics of U.S.-Russian commercial nuclear rivalry from race to the bottom to strategic complementarity. I'm really delighted to welcome our two colleagues from Georgia Tech. One of them, although he still looks like a youngster, I've actually known and worked with for something like 35 years or more. That's Professor Adam Stulberg, who has a title that's not dissimilar from mine. He's the Sam Nunn Professor and Chair of the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. Adam is a specialist on a variety of issues related to global security, global energy issues, Russian politics, and has published very widely, including books dealing with oil diplomacy and Russia's energy, Statecraft, the nuclear renaissance and international security, the end of strategic stability, and other topics in that domain. I can say a great deal about Adam, but I'm not going to embarrass him at this moment in time. And instead, I would also like to simply give a brief introduction to Jonathan Darsey, who's a PhD candidate at the Sam Nunn School, who comes to the graduate school with considerable experience in the private sector and is an expert on data science as well as more traditional international relations methods. So we're delighted to have our two colleagues from Georgia Tech with us. I hope that in addition to our regular audience, we'll have a number of folks associated with Georgia Tech present. And so Adam, it's great to see you, and I give you the floor to proceed as you would like.
Great. Well, JD, can you put the slides up? And while he's doing that, let me just note that one, it's just a real pleasure to be back in front of people, at least on the screen here in Monterey. I have very fond connections there. And as Bill mentioned, I've been following in his wake for many years, but I guess by our titles, I'm slowly starting to make some traction and catching up with our common titles. But there is really a world away from my knowledge and his on these topics. So it's really a great honor to be able to present today our topics here. And let me also note that JD, while he is a PhD student with us, he's spent many years cutting his teeth in the strategic consulting world, where he did a lot of data analytics. And so I've been learning a lot from him since his time here in the program. And I'm excited to be able to share some of our joint efforts at merging data analytics with the topic at hand. So JD, let me know when you're ready to go.
I am theoretically sharing my screen, and I'm assuming from your comment that you are not seeing it.
I am seeing it, but maybe you should hit the full screen. There you go, for everybody. Let's see if that works. Yeah, there we go.
And you can't see the speaker notes, right?
I cannot see. Yeah, we can probably see notes. We see the next slide.
Okay. Okay. You know, there's always an interesting transition when you move from 4 different platforms during a day.
Yeah.
Slideshow.
Is everybody else seeing? Oh, there we go. There.
Yeah. Sorry.
Perfect. Okay. So as Bill mentioned, what we're really interested in talking to you today about is how the changing nuclear energy landscape is generating or not externalities for nuclear security and non-proliferation, and in particular, the changing landscape as it plays out between the United States and Russia on the civil side. So next slide, JD. I don't really have to tell this audience that there really is a power shift going on in the civil nuclear domain, especially featuring the relative statures of the United States and Russia. And when it comes to Russia, we're really seeing an emergence as a dominant player and across the fuel cycle, really involving multiple dimensions of the sort of material side of the civil nuclear trade, and with the geographic and expanding geographic footprint of nuclear sales, really propelled by a creative and entrepreneurial, if not concessionary, and by some measures unfair set of financial packages that are attendant to those that have really made for a very attractive and rising stature. And on the other hand, we've seen the United States really taking it on the chin, where its stature has declined dramatically across the material side of the fuel cycle in particular, and it's struggling to maintain the future of nuclear energy in the United States, notwithstanding the growing demand, and clutching to a role as a significant supplier in the international market. So next slide. And this power shift, if you will, on the civil nuclear side has been directly associated with the changing strategic picture as we look at the emerging dynamics of great power competition, and especially the growing focus on the geoeconomics of great power conflict. And so this, the changing nuclear landscape has been implicated in discussions and manifestations of the sort of power transition, the Thucydides trap. It's been an example used as, ultimately for coercion and conflict. It's been highlighted as a focal point of this gray zone competition across domains that operates in this gray area between existential and non-existential threats. It obviously has been used to highlight the contrast between the ebbing of US geostrategic influence and Russia's growing ability to be opportunistic and punching above its weight, if not challenging the Western liberal order. And it's also been implicated in the sort of the nature of the Russian-Chinese partnership. And they often, when they talk about the changing, the threats associated with the changing civil nuclear energy landscape, there's a tendency to group Russia and China together as posing those greatest challenges. So this is not simply a civil nuclear commercial contest. It's really been implicated as in a much broader geostrategic context. Next slide. And as a result, not surprisingly, the current Assistant Secretary of State, Chris Ford, has actually described this situation as a vicious circle of problems, right? Where the U.S. is ebbing stature on the commercial side, is proposed to be generating less opportunity, as well as reduced influence, which creates an opportunity for Russia to use its predatory practices to engage in a race to the bottom with respect to nuclear security and nonproliferation as a way to edge the U.S. out, and the net result being a reduction in the strength of in the global nonproliferation regime. And it's this sort of loss of civilian competitiveness in the nuclear sector by the United States that really drives three big problems. One, there's a claim that that decline in stature will lead to a decline in U.S. direct influence over customers, over their nuclear security and nonproliferation, that it will lead to this race to the bottom, where Russia today and China in the future will step into that void with lower nonproliferation and nuclear security standards as a way to then, at the third point, for the long term, to create dependencies for political influence and geostrategic influence. And in our paper and our work, we've been looking primarily at the first two issues and trying to tackle the latter one over time. So let me just get right to the heart of the matter and to the bottom line, if you will, of our talk and our work. One is that we have been trying to situate this nuclear energy contest in the broader context of geostrategic competition. And it's part of a growing research agenda that we're looking at that really highlights the dynamics of really geoeconomic competition that is marked by asymmetries in interdependence and connectivity, and really using different forms of cooperation as ultimately ways for manipulation and for practicing competitive strategies, which raise real questions about whether or not this kind of economic space is conducive to the kinds of coercive behavior that we've seen in the past, or not. And so this is one of a number of sectors that we're looking at to see if there is this cross-domain nature of great power competition, and how rigid these domains are and these relationships are, or how flexible they can be used for non-commercial purposes. But the specifics of the relationship between the civil nuclear trade and the nuclear security and non-proliferation landscape, we are a little less pessimistic than many. We see, one, our research does not suggest that there's a clear connection between the classic claims about the stalling of US foreign reactor construction and the loss of influence on the nuclear security and non-proliferation policies of its supplier states. It's not clear that there's any connection there, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, there may be other sources of connection, but that one, which is generally used as a barometer for this debate, I think is problematic. Also, when we look at the sort of race to the bottom issue, we see that Russia, while they certainly had many troubles following the collapse of the Soviet Union and had many lapses in the quality of their restrictions related to nuclear security and non-proliferation attendant to their nuclear energy exports, since 2010, the picture has dramatically changed. And there's been a dramatic enhancement of those and strengthening of those qualitative restrictions, such that the gap is really narrowing between the quality of the US restrictions and the quality of Russian restrictions. But I think the even more dynamic part of this story has to do with the profile risk of the customer states that the two suppliers engage. And here, there's much more complementarity and opportunity for convergence of interests, or these agreements really having minimal to little effect than there is a story about a race to the bottom and one of competition and ultimately conflict on the strategic front. So at the end of the day, ironically, I think, given the nature of the discourse across many different communities, we see the nuclear energy sector as an area of potential engagement between the Russian and US supplier states, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And so the next slide, what we want to do in the remainder of our time here is really sort of unravel some of these points. And I'll talk briefly about what we see some of the gaps in the literature. And this is actually surprising because this literature has looked a lot at the drivers of proliferation, weapons proliferation. There's been some work on the drivers of nuclear energy. And there's actually data on the commitments that countries make in terms of reconciling their commercial interests with their strategic interests. Yet there's not been a lot of work on this particular issue of the nature of these foreign commitments extended in their umbrella agreements and the impact of those and the relationships of those between customer states. And then we want to situate our analysis in this broader framing of great power competition today. And we're going to talk a little bit about how this particular project and our efforts to code and integrate data with respect to nuclear cooperation agreements, specifically the bilateral framework agreements, and the profiles of risks of different customer states into a broader effort at linking data and thinking about great power and visualizing great power competition. And then we'll disaggregate specifically the relationship between these framework agreements and the profiles of the customer states, and then talk briefly about some of the implications. But before I turn, one of the things that I want to make clear that we're doing today is we're trying to uncover patterns of behavior. And in particular, patterns of behavior in the quality of restrictions associated with civil nuclear trade and the profiles of customer states. What we are not doing today is providing a causal explanation. So it's about really trying to identify patterns, empirical patterns, that will be the grist for deeper analysis, either through qualitative analysis of case study work, to understand what explains some of these patterns or other quantitative work. So what we're really trying to do is do some empirical mind sweeping in this particular space to help us identify patterns. And so in the Q&A, we really would invite you not only to help us, or provide critique of these patterns that we're discerning, but maybe we can have a conversation about ways where we can jointly begin to explicate some of these patterns. Because as a political scientist, but also a professor in a professional school of international affairs, which Miss is as well, it strikes me that there are a lot of great people out there doing great work on causal explanations, but we're really in a shortfall, if you will, of discerning new patterns of behavior. We're sort of retreading the same territory, but one way to engage the policy community, I would argue, is to help identify new empirical challenges, policy opportunities that we can sink our teeth into and apply some of these well-oiled validity tests. So with that, let me then turn to the first part of it. So we can talk more about this in the Q&A about where the literature is, and there are many of you I know in looking at the participant list who have been writing on different facets of these things. So I don't want to paint this with too broad a brush, but I do think that this particular relationship between the dynamics in the nuclear energy space, specifically the dynamic shifts in the market and in the commercial landscape, and the link to nuclear security and non-proliferation has not been mined nearly as much as the focus on the specific drivers of non-proliferation and nuclear security, or the drivers of nuclear energy. Of course, Bill wrote a very prominent piece that began to unravel some of the, to look at this, but there haven't been a lot of authors that have looked specifically at this relationship, and there's been good reason. Because in many cases, and throughout most of the Cold War, this was overdetermined. The U.S. was a superpower, dominated across the fuel cycle. So there were many different converging explanations that was hard to unravel this picture. But also, but there were some interesting periods where that began to change. And I would argue now we're in a very different situation, which gives us a big opportunity to explore that. But that has not received as much attention. And there's also, to the extent that some of the quantitative literature has begun to address the relationship between nuclear cooperation agreements and, let's say, weapons proliferation, they have blurred the distinction between umbrella agreements that embody formal commitments that states make with respect to qualitative restrictions on their trade, and all types of commercial agreements, either between companies and other things. So it can either swamp the story with a lot of other commercial agreements that really have nothing to do with the formal commitments and understanding the formal commitments and the credibility of the commitments of the different state actors that are relevant to the nuclear security and non-proliferation side of the ledger. So that has not been accurately captured or disaggregated from the quantitative literature that's out there. Also, when we look at the Russian side of the ledger, I have not seen anyone actually systematically look at all of the Russian agreements. There's a tendency to assume what Russia's interests are and what its behavior is. We look at a couple of case studies, and we infer from those case studies very stylized behavior, or we infer from Russia's behavior in other energy sectors where there may be different market dynamics, different ownership dynamics, and different relative power issues, and just simply different dynamics in these, like natural gas, very different than different stages of the nuclear energy sector. Which is very strange, because as we're going to show you, there are 102 agreements, umbrella agreements. We talk about these in the United States, so we call them the 1, 2, 3 agreements, and they embody these qualitative restrictions on the nuclear trade. But Russia too has them. So there are 58 of those by Russia, signed and enforced by Russia since 1990, and there have been 44 US that have been enforced or signed since 1990. So there's actually data out there and the agreements, while they're not always easy to find, and I will say for any graduate student out there who's interested in doing this work, it's not easy to find all of the US 123 agreements and all of the full text of those things. And the Russian ones also have been a challenge, but we do have them. And what we'll present to you is a coding of those and a comparison of those. Okay, so that's sort of where the literature stands. So now let us go into what we're doing. And so as I mentioned, this is part of a much broader effort that we're undertaking that is trying to look at merging different types of data. So if you go to the next slide, we're trying to, bring events data, which I'll talk about in a minute, text data, and other structured data over time to see if we see different types of patterns of behavior that then would be the basis upon conducting qualitative and quantitative research for causal explanation. So we're trying to identify correlations and patterns of behavior that we may not be able to otherwise see without merging different types of data sources. And so one way we're doing it is by, in the next slide, using what are called events data. And I don't know how well people know about these things, but there are about 5 or maybe there's 7 now events data sets out there. And these are huge data sets, and one of them, GDELT, that is, I think it's updated every 15 minutes. It calls from over, the media, web, print, broadcast media in over 100 countries and languages. And it's, like I said, updated to capture different actors, their behavior, and their behavior towards specific other actors. And those actors can be individuals, they can be countries, they can be companies. And there are millions and millions of pieces of data in there. Now, of course, it's not validated. It's not like looking at the MIDS data set or the COW data set that has been validated, but this is really capturing the discourse across many different communities involving different actors taking specific types of actions against other types of actors. And so what we've done, and there are different codes that they have for these different events and different actors. And what we've tried to do is group some of their codes into different umbrella terms like assertiveness to see, if the US is more assertive than Russia, or to whom is it more assertive, and vice versa. And then as a subset of those, we're looking at coercion terms. And these capture different types of actions that range from the threat of force to the minimal use of force, the ways that we think about coercion. And then we also have terms, there are about 6 terms that capture both economic inducements and positive and negative, sort of sanctions and otherwise. So what we wanted to do and to sort of set up this discussion about nuclear energy is situate where this fits into the great power conflict. How do we think about great power conflict, and how do we visualize it? So the next slide is really looking at the 3 great powers and the frequency of their assertive behavior. And assertiveness captures, taking forceful action, could be signing a treaty as well as using force. So this is taking their international activism. And you can see that there's been and it's normalized as a percentage of each country's overall international behavior, okay? Because each data set tends to have more coverage of the United States, so we want to factor that out by looking at this relative to each other's, their assertive behavior as a percentage of each country's overall international behavior. And you can see for all 3, the frequency across these 2 data sets shows a gradual but steady rise. And one of the things you can do with this data set, if you go to the next page, you can begin to disaggregate it a little bit, and you can begin to annotate it using more structured data to see what actually happened. Remember, this is a discourse of frequency, and then we can plot what actually, is known to happen. So when we look at sort of this, we can, and this is capturing just those more belligerent types of assertive behaviors. So you can see this again, and this is across 4 data sets. So we can now begin to visualize what this steady competition looks like. Now, if you go to the next slide, we can take another cut of this by saying, all right, when we look at those specific frequent events, we want to divide them between those that are cooperative and conflictual. You can see when we talk about great power assertiveness, that there's a lot of cooperation in all of this for all of these countries. And so that's something. So maybe part of the dynamic of looking at this assertiveness also needs to look at the cooperative side of the ledger. Now we look at the negative side and the next slide, which is looking at coercion. This is just a subset of that, looking at the sort of threats of use of force to the minimal use of force. And again, we're looking at two data sets. The top line captures the frequency of the three great powers' coercive behavior. The bottom line, or the middle line, multicolored line, captures the intensity of that coercive behavior. And the solid dark line is where we plot another data set onto this. And this is the modified Global Power Index by RAND that looks at the differential between the United States power and China, right? The notion of the Thucydides trap, that there's a power transition going here, right? And the expectation is that with that power transition going down, we should expect to see much more coercive behavior going up on all parties. Now there is a gradual and modest increase in coercive behavior upon all three of them, but not certainly a dramatic one. But what's really interesting is the intensity of that coercive set of relationship has been relatively constant, notwithstanding this power transition. So this can help us get a sense of what we're actually talking about here when we're thinking about great power competition. And then to get us closer to the nuclear equation, we can disaggregate this because while the frequency is about the same and the intensity is about the same, we go to the next slide, we see that our preferred domains of coercion are quite different. And here's where things start to get interesting. The United States uses a lot of diplomatic threats and coercive behavior, but also relies, as we know, a lot on economic statecraft. Sanctions, of course, have become de rigueur. Russia, if you look, Russia too is using sanctions a bit more, however, relies on them much less than the United States, both quantitatively and a percentage of their overall statecraft. But this is the space where we would be expecting to see the sort of nuclear energy statecraft. And you can see that when we talk about this civil nuclear energy dimension, we're talking about a relatively small wedge, if you will, in the overall picture of coercive behavior. So the next slide is even disaggregating that, and this is looking at economic statecraft. And you can see one thing that comes out that underscores this point is that a big part of economic competition between the great powers involves inducements in actual cooperations or offers of cooperation. The United States, again, in the sort of the darker red, shows that we also have a heavy reliance on sanctions, but Russia really relies heavily on, when it comes to economic statecraft, and providing inducements, offering inducements, and increasingly they've begun to use a negative sanction part. China has historically been much more oriented towards positive inducements. So this is the area where we're looking at nuclear energy. To what extent is nuclear energy really emblematic of this sort of economic dimension of statecraft? But it's important to note that this is, again, a smaller wedge of a much bigger story, and we need to make sure we don't overstate the nature of what's going on in the civil nuclear space. Okay, so let's turn to the civil nuclear space. As I mentioned, we're looking specifically in this talk at the relationship between the respective US-Russian umbrella nuclear agreements, right? These are framework agreements that both countries at the state level sign with customer states that specify the general terms of cooperation, including, as you'll see in the next, including specific restrictions, and we'll get to that in a minute. But here's what the data set looks like. As I mentioned, there are 58 Russian agreements that have been signed or enforced since 1990, and there have been 44 in the US. And one of the things that sort of hits you right off the bat is that the Russians have been much more aggressive in signing these framework agreements since 2010, which really mirrors the consolidation of their nuclear energy sector and their activism in the foreign export markets. But the United States, the bulk of their agreements, almost 50% of our agreements, were signed prior to 1990. Okay, so that's one thing that stands out, this sort of that Russia, while they've been active on the commercial front, has also been active in signing these agreements. Okay, the next slide. We can see that the profile of the general customers are very different. Russia tends to focus on emerging nuclear energy aspirant states, those that have expressed interest in nuclear energy, as well as countries that really haven't expressed really firm plans for nuclear energy, and also to some extent established nuclear states, where the United States has really been primarily focused on engaging established nuclear energy states, and as more so than the nuclear energy aspirant states, or those with really fewer plans. But there seems to be sort of a mutual avoidance or relative mutual avoidance on dealing with nuclear weapon states, or at least a modest engagement. And this is somewhere where there's a mutual, like I said, a mutual aversion, if you will. But there's differences over specific desired targets. Let's go to the next slide. And you can see this variation extends to different regions of the world, where Russia has really been focusing most of its signing its framework agreements in Asia and Africa, and as you'll see, increasingly in Latin America, as opposed to Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere. Whereas the United States has focused the lion's share of its attention on Europe and Asia. So Asia sort of stands out as one area where there may be more head-to-head types of activities. But in the next slide, we can disaggregate that even further, which shows two things. One is Russia's clear preference for dealing with the developing world as opposed to the developed world. And it does highlight that from a sub-regional perspective, that Russia is, that Latin America is emerging as a zone of potential head-to-head competition, as is the case with East Asia. So that's sort of by the numbers, if you will. But of course, we all know that's not the real story. Just signing deals with state really doesn't tell us very much. What we want to know are what is the nature of the restrictions that are embodied in these framework agreements. And so the next slide gives you a summary of the sort of way we coded these agreements. And we basically divided them into 4 types of restrictions: and safeguards, direct transfers, allowances for the indigenous development of ENR capabilities, enrichment and reprocessing, and retransfers. These are common restrictions across across the 2 suppliers, and then we coded them accordingly, and then we'll show you we normalized them to a scale of 100 so that we could compare them. But these are the sort of classic prohibitions that cut across both types of umbrella agreements. Now, there are others. Now, Russia is slightly different. Russia, because they're state-owned companies, they sign other agreements down the road, like spent fuel take-back agreements. There's some agreements on IP that are different. So there's some other differences there. But these are the areas of these are the lion's share of the focal points in the respective agreements that are common across those agreements. So let's begin to look at what this begins to look like. So by the numbers, again, when we look at this coding, you can see that the United States talks about having a gold standard, and the United States clearly stands out at the highest end, with, of course, the deals with UAE and Taiwan, and also Vietnam being very prominent at the high end. And Russia has historically been, stood out with having a large number of agreements at the low end. But the lion's share of both Russian and U.S. agreements are kind of in the moderate to high end of agreements, and we have much more area of overlap of the quality of our overall agreements. So let's go to the next slide. And this is looking at this is disaggregating those different specific restrictions over time, and I think this gives you a great picture that. What we've done is we've also disaggregated enrichment and reprocessing to break that out. And you see a pretty common picture here that following the Soviet collapse for about its first decade, Russia really did bring lower standards in the restrictions that in the framework agreements that it signed. But really since 2010, it's been a very different story. the quality of the agreements across all of these restriction areas has dramatically increased, such that the gap between the quality of Russia's agreements versus the US has narrowed. And this is all the more significant because if you remember in a slide earlier, Russia has signed over 50% of its agreements since 2010. So the period of activism has really been marked by a period of convergence in terms of the aggregate quality of the restrictions embedded in these agreements. Okay, and so there's another way of laying this out, the next slide, which is when we look at different sets of customers. This is the one on the left is when we sort of average out all of those different issue areas that I mentioned over time. It gives you this sort of aggregate picture of convergence really growing from, Rosatom was formed in 2007, began to explore an active export strategy 2010, 2011, and really during that period, we've seen a remarkable convergence. Overall, the middle pane shows you how this convergence has also been reflected in dealings with nuclear energy aspirant states. This is sort of defined by those states by the World Nuclear Energy Association. And then here's looking at one particular region that gets a lot of attention, which is the Middle East. And you can see that while the gap may be a little bit narrow, actually the scale is, you can see that they're roughly the same. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit later. So that you see a qualitative convergence here. Next, JD. And this is sort of this is the nuclear energy aspirant states. This is a breakdown of actual countries, and you can see the slopes of the line show again this dramatic increase in the quality of Russian agreements and the growing frequency of those agreements that Russia has signed, as opposed to a more conservative approach by the United States, clearly with an outlier being the UAE. Okay, the next slide. So this is actually getting us to that first question, that first point that we wanted to talk about. Is there a relationship between U.S. commercial stature as measured by new build reactors abroad and the quality of these restrictions? And one of the things we've seen, right, the United States is virtually falling off the cliff since 2010 in terms of foreign nuclear new builds, where we're the primary vendor. Yet the quality of our agreements has continued to grow incrementally. Russia, on the other hand, has seen a quality of its agreements grow before its dominant stature across the fuel cycle that's been the focal point of most of the attention. So it's not clear that there's even a correlation between this classic measure of the new stature on the nuclear energy front and the quality of these restrictions. Now, there are other measures of nuclear energy stature, and we can talk about those. But this is the one that's primarily, featured in the conversations. Okay, the next slide. All right, and this is looking to the extent to which we go head to head with clients. What are the agreements that we're bringing? And you can clearly see in the case of UAE and Vietnam, the United States brought the A game. And Russia really is lagging. But there are also cases where Russia's the quality of the restrictions embedded in their agreements exceed the 1, 2, 3 agreement, such as with Bangladesh. But for the most part, we're bringing relatively similar restrictions to the party, as coded by these 4 parameters that I mentioned. And so you can see there's much more similarity in terms of our footprint than a sort of head-to-head race to the bottom story, which is really the dominant one that's out there today. So JD? So let me flip it to JD, and what he's going to do is give you another way of thinking about this, specifically looking at the profile risk of customer states. Because what we've just been now talking about is both a quantitative and qualitative aggregate picture of what US 1, 2, 3 agreements look like relative to Russia's, for lack of a better word, 1, 2, 3 agreements. But now let's look at how who the customers they're engaging, and what are the risk profiles according to the safeguards, the theft, safeguards theft, export controls, and also nuclear weapons latency.
And if I could just interject here too, you know, I know we can go on for you know, the full you know, hour and 50 minutes in the presentation, but I want to make sure that we have time to provide feedback. So what I encourage us, if it's possible, not knowing how you kind of divvied up the labor here, is to try to wrap up in around 15 minutes or so that we have plenty of time for discussion, because I think it's such a rich menu that you've already presented that we reserve time for a good Q&A here.
Yeah, we weren't sure exactly when we saw that long time space, we weren't sure how to, if we were on there or not. So, but JD's got about 15 minutes worth to give you a sense of this. So
that'll be great. So as Adam said, I'll go over 4 things here. And these are looking at complementarity. And complementarity is a large word that I would define as common good that comes across not from coordinated collaboration, but as a nature of how the 2 states are acting. The opposite of this would be the destruction of value or the increase of risk that could be is baked into the assumptions of many of the cycle of cycle of doom that has been described by Secretary Ford and others about the nuclear industry and nuclear risk in the world. So we're looking at 4 areas of complementarity. This also will give you a view for how we think about expanding the aperture. And for us, it really has 2 dimensions. One is widening and looking at not just the direct problem, which in this case is the cooperation agreements and comparing the cooperation agreements between Russia and the United States, but looking more broadly at the context of how these agreements are signed. And the second is to deepen or accrete knowledge on top of each other. So the example of the widening the aperture is looking at how these agreements may support the adoption of the additional protocol, which I'll cover first. Deepening the engagement with the data and using it for multiple other purposes is what we do when we layer on top of it this one data source that we create with other data sources that are in related areas, and that by putting and juxtaposing the 2, we can potentially create new insights on how the things are operating in this environment. And we have 3 examples of that, which are with the 2 risks associated with the customer states, specifically theft of nuclear materials, and then the quality of export controls. And then finally, the overall meta problem, which is of proliferation. So I'll first tackle the additional protocol. And there is, as Adam mentioned, many of the agreements that Russia has signed have been since 2010. And since the additional protocol came into play in 1997, one of the things that we look for in the agreements was whether the extent to which the agreement either supported or did not support the existing regime for overall for non-proliferation. So before 1997, that was the comprehensive agreement that every NPT party state is supposed to sign with the IAEA. And after 1997, we looked at whether the additional protocol was incorporated into the agreement or not. And it's an interesting exercise, because as parties, depository states for the NPT, and as board members of the IAEA, you would expect that there would be close to certain compliance with the AP once it was put into place. Interestingly enough, though, when we broke it down and we looked at the agreements that were only signed since 1997 for the US and for Russia, and then, which are represented on the left-hand side here, and then we looked at how many of those agreements where Russia or the United States actually could have an impact. And that essentially means the states that have not signed the additional protocol yet. And in the case of both Russia and the United States, a large number of the agreements that the US and that Russia have signed that are new since 1997 were actually with states that had already joined and ratified a IAEA additional protocol to their existing comprehensive safeguards agreements. So for the United States, about half of exactly half, if you do math, already had the AP in place. For Russia, it was actually more like 2/3, with 32 of the agreements already had that in place. And those are agreements that really, obviously the AP is there, so AP is not really going to be, the agreement's not really going to be a factor. Looking at focusing on the 8 agreements that the United States had where the customer state did not have an AP in place, and the 15 for Russia, instead of seeing 100% compliance, we actually saw quite low compliance from the perspective of Russia and the United States forcing through the agreement that the party that they're signing the agreement with joins the AP. In the case of Russia, there was only one of the 15 agreements where the AP was a requirement of the cooperation agreement that Russia signed with the party state. For 14 out of 15, Russia did not, for whatever reason, did not incorporate AP language into their agreement text. For the United States, surprisingly also, there were only 3 out of the 8 where the AP text was included in the agreement. And the question is really, I think there's 2 things that are interesting from this. The first thing is the question of why are United States and Russia not pushing the AP to 100% of their agreements. Obviously, there's some agreements that were in process when the AP was first put into place in '97, but there's a lot of agreements that have not been, it appears to not have been worked into the negotiation process. The second thing I would say from this is that for the states that Russia or the United States signed agreements with that included AP language, which were 3 agreements for the United States and the 1 agreement for Russia, those states did comply, and they adopted the AP before the cooperation agreement was ratified. So my takeaway from that is that there is some evidence that if the language supporting the AP or other requirements are incorporated into the cooperation agreements signed by Russia and the United States, there is an opportunity to help encourage them to actually get compliance with those broader security initiatives. But there's there are many agreements that are left on the table, and there's opportunity for cooperation that seems to have been missed. This is even highlighted even further if you look at the actual states for the United States and for Russia, where the AP was not, that language was not included in the requirements in the terms of the nuclear cooperation agreement. And there's very little overlap. Now, most of these states have since adopted the AP, so for those states it's moot. But for example, for the states like Algeria and Bolivia and Egypt, which have not, and in the case of Egypt is a continuing proliferation concern, this appears to be an area where both the United States and Russia have expressed support, and they have a natural interest in pushing for compliance with the additional protocol, as it benefits everyone from enhanced security and enhanced respect for the International Atomic Energy Agency. And there is engagement with states that are problematic, but there is some opportunity being left behind for perhaps cooperation or for perhaps just living up to our own expectations in both the case of Russia and the United States. So complementarity from this perspective I think, paints an interesting picture that isn't exactly in line with, I think, the rosier story that the United States paints, or the rosy story that Russia paints as a good partner and a non-proliferating partner. Second look that we looked at was at nuclear latency, which is the development of capabilities on the road to nuclear weapons. And there are several different ways, obviously, you can think about latency. We chose to use the Furman and Tix data set and their definition. They have their paper, which came out 4 years ago, includes a data set that goes back to 1945 and looks at every state in the world and the capabilities that they had, at least as far as has been reported with regards to their fuel cycle capabilities. So this is a measure, and Adam showed this before, when we're talking about latency in this context, we're talking about states that have either a test or a pilot facility for enrichment or reprocessing, and in which they have introduced nuclear materials to perform activities of reprocessing or enrichment. With the idea of those states are, let's say, the proxy of being on the path to developing a fuel cycle capability, which is one of the most difficult parts of the nuclear weapon procurement process.
Right.
So in this case, we looked at and really dug into the orange countries, the 19 US agreements that were with countries that have achieved nuclear latency at some point since 1945, and the 14 on the Russian side that have achieved latency since 1945. And again, there's a story here of, there's a lot of overlap, which can have, depending on how it plays out, can have either a additive or a detractive component. But of the 34 countries that have achieved latency since 1945, if you take out the nuclear weapons states, there are 24 countries that are where there's a potential for some influence by nuclear cooperation. Of those, Russia and the United States, either one or both, cover almost all of those, 18 out of the 24. And you can see here, the red indicates the Russian agreements, and the blue indicates the agreements for the United States. This just shows the progression and basically the sequence of when the agreements were signed within the 1990 to 2019 time period that we were looking at. The purpose of this is to understand is there truly a race to the bottom? If there is, with regards to latency, it would be expressed in significantly worse quality agreements, lower scores of the agreements with the non-proliferation scores. And although there are differences in the scores, and there's certainly some instances where there are significant differences, such as in the Czech Republic, where Russia has a much lower score for their agreement, which they assigned after the US agreement. But in most cases, Russia and the United States have either complementary footprints, or the differences in the agreement scores are not as significant as one might expect from the rhetoric and from some of the literature on race to the bottom. So if you look at the actual influence, we mapped these agreements to the actual proliferation, the latency status of states over the time period that overlaps between the Furman data, which goes through 2012, and our cooperation agreement data set. And we looked and saw and tried to find, are there points of where the latency status of the partner state that US or Russia had an agreement with changed. So the latency status is represented on the bar charts on the right, and green means that the state is not latent. Yellow means that the state has latent capability. Again, that is defined by having either a pilot or a lab facility that does enrichment or reprocessing and has nuclear materials in which they are reprocessing or enriching them. And red means nuclear weapons status. So the key things to look at are the places where the colors change. So the top bar, for example, shows Algeria, which until 1991 had never achieved nuclear latency. And in 1992, they had their first enrichment. It was a lab enrichment facility or reprocessing. It's a little fuzzy because they have not been completely forthcoming with the IAEA, nor has China, who was their cooperation partner. But they did, at that point, they achieved nuclear latency. That is the only state actually that achieved latency during this time period. That was for the first time. All the other states have achieved latency before then. So that's a transition point to look at. And in this case, there's no Russia or US agreement. Russia has an agreement with Algeria, but it did not go into force until 2014, well after the state achieved latency. The other bars to look at are, for example, at the bottom where the blue arrow is on top of the green, a green area, which represents the latency status of Spain, Sweden, Taiwan, and Serbia since 1990. The green indicates that they have remained latency free. They've remained not latent the entire time period, even though in the past they've had latency. So the only agreement that is in place with all four of those countries, in this case, is with the United States, which has had agreement either with the country itself or with Euratom, or in the case of Spain, a combination of the two. And in that case, you see that these agreements, the United States had an agreement the entire time, is remained latent. There's no cause, that's an interesting finding, but it's certainly not causal. And if you look across all of these, latency, and there's very little relationship that we can see where there is a transition point that has occurred where either Russia or the United States has an agreement. There are clearly some places where a state has either gone from non-latent to latent, such as with Algeria. And there are clearly 3 states that have changed, gone into the nuclear or out of the nuclear weapon category. So Pakistan and North Korea went nuclear during this time period. South Africa, gave up its nuclear weapons. And in all 3 of those cases, there was no cooperation agreement in place of this type with the United States or Russia. There were other things that were going on, but they're different. So I think that there is, we spend a lot of time, and there's a lot of print spent on how much the risk of escalation and the risk of vertical proliferation within a state as they move up the fuel cycle and potentially into a nuclear weapon capability. But from just an initial pass at looking at the agreements and the quality of the agreements, there isn't a lot of evidence that shows that there is a clear relationship, at least for Russia and the United States. There is a suspicious, there's a common element that is not shown on this chart, which is China's relationships and China's cooperation agreements, which, unlike the US or Russia, are completely opaque. It is virtually impossible to find any Chinese agreements are extremely difficult to find. Russia actually is more, Adam commented earlier on finding agreements. Russia is actually more transparent than the United. It's easier to find their agreements than the United States because they have all of their legislation online, which the United States does not provide quite so easily. So I think the 2 lessons, one is that the latency connection with cooperation agreements is not clear, and then second, some other emerging literature. And the second is that, if anything, there's the interests of the United States and Russia are probably closer aligned than they are with China, which we commonly do not know exactly what they're doing.
So JD, why don't we just show them the next slide on the strategic trade controls, and then as an example of another way of looking at it, and then we'll go to the wrap it up.
Yeah, so we looked at 2 other things. One was strategic trade control quality, and the other was on the risk of nuclear theft. So this is an example of overlaying the Peddling Peril Index, which measures quality of strategic trade controls, versus the agreement strength that we measured in our agreements. And the idea here is to understand, is there a relationship, is there a helping or a hindering of tailoring of the cooperation agreements to the quality of the trade controls and the risk of diversion within a state. So ideally, in this case, you would want to see a line that would go from the top left to the bottom right, where the strongest agreements would be associated with the worst states. So you would offset the risk of trade problems, of trade diversion with a stronger agreement. And one of the interesting things from this research and overlaying this is that although Russia does not have a UAE or a Taiwan type gold standard agreement, Russia does have a lot of agreements that are in the top left, which are agreements that are above average and as far as the non-proliferation strength of their agreement, the restrictions that are against proliferation in the cooperation agreement they signed. And they have signed those with states that have worse than average risk of trade diversion i.e. they have worse than average strategic trade control. So there's a complementarity there, I think, between the United States and Russia, in that Russia is signing agreements with a lot of countries. They're tailoring the terms of the agreement to the risk of the country. And they're doing so with countries that the United States, for either strategic or business reasons, is not doing business with, such as Tajikistan, Uganda, Vietnam, Paraguay, and Nigeria. So we've done this with other data, and I think that there's a rich set of analyses that we can do and insights that we can accrete from using the data that we've already collected. So
let's go to the NNSI one. No, one more. Go back one more. No, the other direction.
Oh, sorry.
So
sorry here.
Okay, so this is the same picture with the using the Nuclear Security Index, and it looks at the time, and that index allows you to actually look at more improvement over time. But it really gets to the same picture that JD is mentioning. And that top left quadrant is the one where you have higher risk countries, but where Russia is bringing more so than the US, higher quality agreements. Although there are obviously countries of concern in that bottom left quadrant where Russia is signing a lot of agreements with countries that do pose the theft problem. And the larger circle has to do with the coding of the NSI. So let's just go to the last slide, JD, and let's just wrap this up and we can have some conversation. Bottom line is, when we look at this picture, we see a lot more complementarity than a race to the bottom. As I mentioned, in terms of Russia, they certainly faced a decade of real challenge and lower quality agreements, but since 2010, their agreements have improved relative to their own agreements, and the gap is narrowed with the US agreements. And we do see that there are areas of complementarity, especially with dealing with customers that pose challenges on the export control side and on the nuclear theft side. And there are areas potentially where we have convergent interests in both mutually strengthening the AP requirement. This could be an area where we both have brought relatively similar profiles, and there's room for improvement there. Where on the other two, the export control and nuclear and theft issues, we're dealing with different types of states for the most part. And in a more holistic perspective, we are complementing each other. I think and that has to do with, therefore, I think looking at the bilateral framework agreements and this complementarity does provide opportunity for cooperation, especially in dealing with horizontal proliferation challenges. But as JD mentioned, when it comes to vertical proliferation challenges, and sort of using latency as a benchmark, it's not clear that these agreements matter at all. There are other factors that are driving behaviors. And actually, a colleague of mine, Rachel Whitlark, has done a quantitative study on not using these particular agreements, but looking at nuclear cooperation agreements in general, and not found any kind of decisive relationship with latency decisions. So, which I think casts a different light on when are we applying the gold standard? If the concern for countries like Saudi Arabia is that they're going to be developing a nuclear weapons hedge, well, these framework agreements and the gold standard agreement may not be as relevant to that concern, as opposed to concerns about horizontal proliferation. We can talk about that in more detail. But the last point I would mention is that maybe the opportunities for cooperation and realizing these complementary interests or convergent interests in the AP are premature given the political state of the relationship today between US and Russia. But I would argue that we need to move off of these memes and off of this trope of the Russians engaging in a race to the bottom, bringing low standards, because it not only is it empirically problematic, which then only promotes the acrimony, but it also leads to a false sense of this gold standard that can put more constraints on our industry. And as our colleagues at the Harvard's Belfer Centers also are beginning to show, the more that nuclear energy and the opportunity for nuclear energy, let's say with SMRs or Generation 4, are linked to proliferation and security issues, the less public support there is for nuclear energy. So even if for domestic political purposes and our own interests in promoting strategic trade of our nuclear industry, sticking with this trope, I think, is problematic. So with that, let us stop. We've given you a lot to chew on. So we're happy to go into this with more detail.
Thanks so much, Adam. Let me see if we can go back to the full screen here so I can see people. That was really superb. I mean, I know we kind of rushed you a little bit, but that was only because I think there are lots of questions. I know my questions alone could readily exhaust the time that we have remaining in the seminar here. And so I will try not to abuse my position as the moderator here, but I do want to compliment you in particular with the manner in which you kind of match the aggregate data analysis, the theoretical insight, and the case studies, which I think one could focus on as a follow-up to the work that you've been doing. So I just found it tremendously, fascinating. Let me, as I wait for people to raise their hand, let me return to something that we've talked a little bit about, prior to this seminar, but I do think it merits some discussion. You kind of used as the cutoff point the period since we had a Russian Federation, and you make reference to the change in behavior, which you characterize as a positive change from the immediate preceding period, which is the later years of the Soviet Union. But I think on an impressionistic level, I would suggest that in fact, the later years of the Soviet Union represented a regression from what had been a higher quality of Soviet nuclear export behavior than in the last years. And so what I think would be quite interesting to do, I mean, I have a few cases in mind, but what I haven't done is looked at the larger body of Soviet nuclear umbrella agreements with many kind of client states in the earlier period of the Soviet nuclear relationship. So I think it'd be quite interesting to see if we could get a hold of, which I suspect we could, those agreements in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, and the first half of the 80s, and compare that to what you have done in the Russian period. Because I'm not sure. I mean, I don't dispute the fact that what you show empirically as the case for the immediate post-Soviet period is correct, but I question whether or not the last years of the Soviet period are characteristic of the broader Soviet approach to export controls. And I think that would make also an interesting comparison between the Soviet period and the US period for that same timeline. So that's a kind of a suggestion. You may or may not wish to comment on it, but if it were possible, I think it'd be an interesting research project.
No, I mean, there's not really much to say. We really didn't look at that period. We were actually in our writing, we actually reference your work that suggests that may not have been the halcyon days may not have been right before the Soviet collapse, and that the decline may have predated the Russian one. But, I think we were really focusing on the contemporary period, and you get into measurement problems, you get into we were trying to keep as many conditions static, and so we were just looking at the Russian Federation. But you're right, that would be a great, and I mean, that would be something we could really benefit from, I'm sure.
So who would like to get us started here? Hen Kane and then Sandy Spector, I see, and for our students and younger colleagues on the line, please don't hesitate to partake as well. Hen?
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, JD. And I thought that was wonderful and really interesting. I have about 7 comments, which I will go really fast, and we can have this conversation later on. So the first is that we actually, and Noah, that I'm sorry is not here, but he's based in Vienna and probably already asleep, hopefully, has been doing some comparison for me and with me on some of the Russians' supplier agreements. So that's, we can compare notes, and I think it would be really interesting to see that. Another thing is it's a question. As you probably know, the Russian legal framework agreements are built on 3 different stages. And I
Mhm.
wonder if actually you looked on all those three, because there is the Intergovernmental Agreement on Peaceful Nuclear Energy Cooperation, and then when there's some progress, then they have the Intergovernmental Agreement on Cooperation Building, Operating NPP, and then the ones
Mhm.
about between authorized organizations. And as we go farther down or progress, actually restrictions are piling up. So I think, I don't know if you looked at those or not, but I will encourage you to do. And I completely agree with you with the conclusion that the Russians, on some aspect, Russia is getting much better about the restriction or leveling up to the US restrictions. I will also ask in the cooperation agreement, my problem is that cooperation agreements do not indicate anything in the sense of like Russia can go and have cooperation agreement and US, whoever they want. That doesn't mean anything about non-proliferation or proliferation in the sense of 90% of those countries will never have nuclear energy program or any other nuclear installations. So I will encourage you to actually look on countries that have plans in some advanced stage, because otherwise it doesn't really mean much. If Uganda agreed to not have any reprocessing and enrichment, nice to have, but really that will not really matter much in non-proliferation world. The other part is that, so what you define as activism, I would say look at activism when it actually matter in both countries. I would say also you need to sort of keep in mind that US obviously do not export anything in the last 7-8 years, but you might want to see how South Korea are changing their restriction based on US demands because of grandfathering agreements. So when you look on aggressive, sometimes the US does it through South Korea because A, they have no other option, and B, they can do it. Fourth or fifth, God knows one. I don't know if, when you look on enrichment provisions or restrictions, if you gave different grades to above 20% or prior consents or completely not allowing enrichment. So this is just a questions about grading. APA's condition of supply, I would say that you give a little bit, I will have questions about your methodology, because you look at many countries that the US have cooperation agreements since the 70s and the 80s, and they are renewed every 5 years, and usually they're renewed automatically. So when you say Turkey 2000 or Egypt, whatever, to the last time, those are renewed automatically. There is no change in, so unless you can say they were renegotiated and there were some new language that put into it, but not the AP as a demand, then I will say, okay, you're right. But if those agreements are coming from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and nothing has changed, but suddenly you expect them to have a condition of supply of AP, that's a little bit unfair. And it's almost as like you were saying, the NPT in 1995 should have 10 additional provisions, but that's, I would say, unfair. They were just renewed. And then I will have some questions about how you define latency. And granted, I'm tired, and I'm so happy that this is recorded, so I can go back and actually see how you define it, because I'm sure I missed many good and important points. But I think if you define latency as any countries that have reactor almost, I would say your bar is a little bit too low. I will put it a little bit higher,
Well,
by enrichment and reprocessing capabilities.
good points. Well, let me
And
just.
you don't need to answer all of them. I will let others to take their questions.
Well, no, I think you kind of hit on a couple of things, and one thing I want to just say about the data. We are data agnostic. The one data source that is addressing nuclear latency, there are actually two data sources. We took the one, but we certainly could take another. And latency is an issue that's really not well defined. And there's an emerging field, as you know, that is trying to put better metrics there. So we just use the one that everybody else is using, with the caveat that you're exactly right. ENR is way too low a bar, but it begins to give a picture and begins to raise some questions. We are sensitive to the different nature of the Russian legal regime. And we are looking, and actually, I think it only bolsters the case because they have follow-on agreements, the take-back agreements and other dimensions that actually strengthen their arrangements. So we did take that into account. And when we write the paper up, we actually note those caveats in some of those cases. With respect, you have an interesting point about like, who are you looking at? And, should we, one of the problems with quantitative studies is you put a lot of cases that don't matter. It can understate the patterns that do matter. Well, on the other hand, you can't just sort of pick on the dependent variable either. You can't just only look at those countries that matter. So we were trying to do a little bit of both. And we were basically looking at, you say, for example, Uganda, out of the top of your head, doesn't matter. Well, that may not matter for the development of a nuclear energy program, but when the NNSI or PPI code them as being a problem for export controls because things may pass through them, or some of the East Asian states or some of the Middle Eastern states, they are of proliferation concern. And as a result, having restrictions that are associated with those agreements, even if nothing materializes on the ground, as we've seen in countries like Singapore and UAE prior to its nuclear program, these were transit places. So I do think they are part of the bigger story, and they're captured and they figure prominently in some of these other data sources that, again, what we're trying to do is link these to those other data sources out there. Same thing with the additional protocol. There are a lot of issues there. We just wanted to give you kind of a schematic view. This is a direction you can take. And I think that no matter how you cut it, there are a lot of curious questions there. I think the most curious question is, why is it when the countries have signed the additional protocol, when both the United States and Russia are signing their 1, 2, 3 agreements, they don't build that in? Okay, they only do that part of the time. So either why do they build it in, or why don't they just completely exclude it? So it's weird that they have variation there. So I mean, there are a lot of ways that we can refine these things. But that one is probably more suggestive of areas of our future research. But I do think that when it comes to the PPI and NNSI areas, those countries have been identified as for concerns for different reasons than just having a nuclear energy program.
Can I make 2 short comments? One is just on the grading of enrichment. We did distinguish between the 20% threshold, as well as pre-authorization or not, whether you needed to have authorization before you did any of these activities, or whether you had agreement unless you reach certain limits. So we tried to take into account the quantity, the quality of the level at which you could enrich, as well as the idea overall of enrichment. So tried to pull out as much detail based on what was in the agreements themselves as possible, and we use that in the coding. The other thing is the interesting point of the Russia agreements. We made sure that we did not pick up any of the agreements that were not the basic general cooperation between between Russia and a given state. In doing that, I reviewed a lot of agreements that were the subsequent agreements that were for the reactor builds or for the transfer of materials. And in addition to the fact that it does bolster the case for Russia having the ability to strengthen their agreements over time, it's also an interesting commercial question of, even if Russia can use that to strengthen it over time, but it's also a way for Russia to compete more effectively because they essentially could have a lower bar for entry for signing an agreement with the country, or they could start cooperating and then later ratchet up the terms of that cooperation, because they have to, by law, sign these additional deals that are legally binding on the state and on Rosatom as they actually move from the idea of cooperation to actually cooperating. That is a whole entire another project.
You're muted, Bill.
I'll take that as that you were speaking to me to make my comment, although we couldn't hear you, Bill.
I'm sorry, I'm muted here. Excuse me. Sandy, I wanted to thank JD and Adam for their reply, and then give the floor to you. Excuse me.
Good. Well, I think one amazing virtue of this presentation is how much information you pull together and how many thoughtful ways you've developed to analyze them. And I think, you know, it's imperfect, I'm sure, only because it's so rich. And you'll be finding things that you want to adjust and modify a little bit as time goes on. But having just got this assembled is already a huge accomplishment. So I really, you know, have to take my hat off to you. One such refinement I would propose, which is quite easy, I think. It's this really interesting chart you have about the timing of states adopting or not adopting the additional protocol as you move through their relationship with the supplier partner. So it's either before the time of the agreement for cooperation, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's one other element which comes at the right-hand side of the chart, which is, was the agreement, additional protocol in place prior to the first significant export? And I think we have a good example with China where we had a level, well, we can all talk about how good the agreement was, but it was an agreement. And then it just froze for years until they made certain concessions. And I have a feeling in some of these cases, you know, the administration has probably said, look, nothing's happening right away. We'll work on them. This is not the agreement for cooperation is not the last word. We still have the licensing process, and there'll be opportunities to bring some pressure to bear. So I would just add that, and I think it's, you know, it's very easily quantified. So I think it would be just a nice addition. The only other comment I would make is that your core argument that this is not a race to the bottom, I think has been made very powerfully. But one other point that you make, and I think you just sort of, it was at the very end of the presentation, but I think I saw it, which said, and the scale of American nuclear exports doesn't matter a whole lot. That the agreements, you know, even without exports, we're still making strong agreements. And it's the diplomacy that really matters here a bit more than the actual exports. And I think I'm not putting words in your mouth, I think it's there, but I don't think it came out prominently as it might.
Well, Sandy, that's last point is a great one because, you know, there's a researcher, I forgot her first name, Jewel. She's done a really interesting study. She's looked at the cooperation agreements, not the umbrella agreements, but all the different trade agreements. And one of the things that's really fascinating is that, yes, Russia dominates the material side of the nuclear trade across the fuel cycles, 60 to 70%, depending on what the metric is. But the United States has 60% of the non-material side, right? The safety, security, non-proliferation. The United States is dominant of that. And the question I had Dan Poneman in the teach our class the other day, and I asked him this question. I said, well, you know, we make it seem like we need to sell a reactor to maintain the influence on these other important things that are directly related to proliferation. And, you know, and he basically says, well, you can't sustain that over time if you're not part of the trading agreement. But it's not clear to me. And of course, we showed you the reactor build, and there's really no, I mean, that's not a very good measure if you're going to make that case. But your point is a very good one. And it strikes me that the United States has other diplomatic forms of leverage. And I think that's especially relevant when it comes to vertical proliferation cases like Saudi Arabia or other ones, where there are other things that we can bring to bear, not our nuclear trade as the one that's going to drive that factor. But that's to be continued. This is just sort of the pattern that we've seen. I don't know if that's the case.
Yeah, and there's also, I mean, if you look at how the way you find these agreements, you have to, within Russia, you have to look for, usually you have to look for the country, the partner country. And I noticed this interesting pattern of a signing of an agreement for peaceful nuclear cooperation with a country like Uganda, which is never going to have a nuclear reactor. And at the same time, signing an agreement for peaceful space exploration. So there's this, it's a small sample, not scientific, but Russia seems to be using these cooperation agreements and using that in conjunction with other tools where it has an advantage and is seen as having a proficiency across the world, such as in space, and using those as instruments to perhaps build relationships, even if the cooperation is never really going to happen. Is Uganda going to send somebody up into space? I don't know. But it seems like it's potentially these agreements are being used that way. So we should probably study them as instruments of statecraft in and of themselves, as well as instruments of
Atoms for peace.
counter-proliferation.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. Let me make an observation, then I'm going to ask Veronica if she'd like to ask the question that she sent to me kind of privately, but I think it would be good for her to express her views as well. You know, the one thing I would suggest is another source of data that, I mean, if you were engaged in the case studies of a number of the bilaterals that you mentioned here, I think you would find commentary on the part of the recipient country, which might in some instances express frustration related to the stringency of controls that have been promoted either by the United States or Russia. I mean, again, I've discovered this with respect to some cases, so I would suspect that it's more frequent than not. You're not going to find this from an aggregate data standpoint, but if you were to explore any one of the individual bilaterals, I suspect you would find commentary from parties who believe that the screws are being turned too hard, either by Moscow or Washington. So that's just a suggestion for further work. Veronica, would you like to?
About that, because that is a really interesting point in the sense that, take Saudi Arabia, for example, where I frankly think this is an opportunity where the US and Russia have much more convergent interests than Russia does with China. And that, as you know, notwithstanding that maybe that 90s period or the pre-90s period where Russia, is standard as a leader of the non-proliferation regime dipped, historically, they've spent a lot of time building up the current regime. And this is an area where the two of us are leaders and actually complementary. And the more daylight there is between us in terms of our, the political acrimony, the more it creates opportunities for others to bring in, lower standards or nothing else, opaque standards, and allows those customer states to engage with their frustrations, those third-party actors. Saudi Arabia says the United States risking the seat at the table by holding out the gold standard. So yeah, definitely.
Thanks, Adam. Veronica, do you want to introduce yourself and then ask the question?
Hi, thank you. I'm Veronica, a student at MIS. And you may have addressed this in response to Mr. Spector, but my question is, so are there some maybe intervening or confounding variables related to the patterns of behavior of the US and Russia in specific regions? So an example, political influence or resource access that may or may not dictate the terms of those agreements.
That's a great point. And let me just be clear again, we're not really offering any causal explanation for things. So so your point is well taken. There could be other variables that are like, for example, we can't explain why they sign any of these agreements, right? We're not pretending to do that. What we're trying to do is see if there's a correlation between when they sign it, who are they signing agreements with, what's the gap between them, et cetera, et cetera. But you're exactly right. That's where the research should go. However, we kind of went through a couple of those slides. If you look at the Nuclear Security Index slide, because that one, there have been 4 cuts of those security index. So it gives us a time period where we can see improvements over time by countries. And actually, you can see there are a couple of cases, especially in the Middle East, where Russia has signed agreements, and we've seen a modest increase in the nuclear security score of those countries. Now, whether or not that's due to those agreements, I don't know. But it does give us an opportunity to test those agreements against other variables. As I mentioned, my colleague has looked at this variable to explain nuclear latency, and they don't really see anything with it. So it does suggest that there's a lot more going on. But this goes back to an earlier point that Ken raised, which is why look at these agreements, right? Because these are just the umbrella. They're not the real tangential things, the material agreements like the actual ones between the vendors. Well, I would argue that these agreements are what embody the formal commitments by states. So this is a real good test of whether or not those commitments are credible or not. So it gets into what their behavior is, because that's the first thing to look at, in my mind, at the state level, is what those commitments are. The other one is this change in time over in certain, and we want to find different types of dependent variables, things that we want to explain that change over time, and then pit them against exactly the kinds of alternative explanations that you mentioned. And so one thing just off the top of our head is there's a data set on influence that captures the influence of one country over another country. So one of the things we could do is map that over, and that captures a whole host of other variables about influence to see if that matters versus the timing of the agreement matters. And then you'd have to do more causal analysis, but you're exactly right. That's where we want to go with these things.
Thank you.
Oh, you're muted again, Bill.
Excuse me. I don't see other hands up, but I'm pleased to call upon anyone who has a question to ask. One thing that I'm kind of curious about as I wait to see if any other hands come up before we kind of wind down here.
I have a question.
I wonder, okay, I'll call in just one second. I wondered the extent to which either Russian policymakers or their US counterparts are actually aware of the nature of their behavior in regard to the kind of the patterns that you've identified. They may be aware of specific instances. And it's I think an interesting question too, because it's not a single player on the US side or on the Russian side. There are different agencies whose role in export policy clearly on the Russian side has changed over time. And so I think it might be interesting for you to give a briefing of this to interagency groups with responsibility for export controls in the United States and Russia. They might be as surprised as you were, perhaps, in terms of your findings, because I suspect they're not at all familiar with the historical dimension, and they may not even be aware of their current behavior kind of writ large. So I'm thinking, as looking at kind of at Sarah's name here, I don't see her face on the screen at the moment, but as we do some of our bilaterals, I think it would be very interesting to have you and JD present to some of these export control officials and to get their take. And somebody that I would really encourage you to engage with, and I can facilitate this if you would like, is the current Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, who before he became an arms control negotiator and senior official, had major responsibilities for Soviet export control policy and then Russian export control policy. So I think he would actually be quite interested and maybe a source of some information for us.
Well, definitely, we'll follow up with you on that. But let me just give you a little bit of history on some of these things.
Sure.
So I have actually presented this to individually, not collectively, to a number of senior U.S. officials. And the response is interesting, but you don't really know the whole story. Okay? And then I keep saying, well, what is the story? What is the base? And it does kind of get to what Sandy was talking about. There are other diplomatic forms of leverage. And I'm saying, then fine. Why are you making it about nuclear energy sales then? Let's make it about those other things. And so there's this sort of, when you kind of lay bare the patterns, the response is, well, I sat in this room with so-and-so and I know what really drove them. Okay, so there. But when I also gave this presentation pre-COVID in Moscow, and there, of course, you can imagine there was a lot of interest in it. Now, very much an interest in talking about post-2010, not so much of an interest in talking about the Mikhailov period and some other periods in the 1990s, but there was they were willing to engage on cases, on areas where we have mutual problems, and the AP being something that they were willing to talk about. And this notion, they like this notion of complementarity, because at the end of the day, the US nuclear industry is not going to be doing business with a lot of those countries in the top left quadrant, not to mention the bottom left quadrant. So somebody's got to go in there with these, with some standards, and that Russia is doing that is an opportunity for us to engage with them as partners to help raise the bar generally. But this is a challenge. We just gave this talk, by the way, at CSIS, and they go and they look at all this thing, and again, it's like interesting, but but again, my experience dealing with this country is that this is what's going on. And I'm like, okay, again, let's make it about those factors. Let's not keep bringing nuclear energy trade as the cudgel for this. And so but I'm all for it. I really want, because I do think this is an area where we can be partners. And when the dust settles in the political acrimony, this is what we need to pick. And this is an area that Russia sees its stature. We want to engage with Russia as a partner on this. When we have in the past on Iran, it's been constructive at times. And so, I mean, but that's that. Please, Pожалуйста, help us make those contacts.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up here. So, Mashoud, you have the floor. Please introduce yourself and ask your question or comment.
Thank you. My name is Mashoud Oshodi. I'm a MPTS student, and in hopes of graduating this December. So yeah, the Middlebury Institute has been a wonderful institution. I've been with the college for about 2 years. I'm really excited, and all this the data especially, I'm really excited about. So first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative and insightful. I appreciate the data analytics, and as I said, and its comprehensive insights and direct or indirect correlation to the emerging, nuclear states and the portfolio scores, you shared between the United States and Russia. Specifically, my question is related to the correlations and dependencies in relationships between all states, right? Were there any thoughts or efforts towards applying like a machine learning layer to the data? With machine learning, you need like that Goldilocks zone, that perfect trend line, the transition of a state from a non-nuclear to nuclear energy, regardless of which country the agreement, is established with. And the reason I ask is, somewhat of a predictive insights into the trends with, future agreements, influence or nuclear, security scores, as you mentioned. Thank you.
JD, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. Yeah, well, as a data geek, I appreciate your question. I think so we're doing not exactly what you're asking about with regards to the agreements. We are, this is, as Adam mentioned, it's part of a bigger project. And part of the bigger project is understanding how this is one microcosm and one perspective on how Russia and the United States and China think about how they engage in changing the behavior of other states. So what are the interests and the drivers of the behavior that's observed? And for that, we are examining the literature, Russian academic literature, Russian language, media reports that are associated with these deals to help understand, and using machine learning to do that, to read things that we can't read with, given the constraints of that we have as humans of not being able to comprehend as quickly as machines, a very large quantity of text, and try to extract insights from that to see what are some of the beliefs and interests that are behind the behavior of these cooperation agreements. So we're using it for that. For the case of these specific agreements, they're pretty sparse as far as data. There's, at the most, we're looking at a 30-year period, and we have 102 agreements, and that's the 52 that were for Russia. I think there's only 2 that we couldn't find that we know about, and so I think it's more of the predictive of seeing the context around it. That's a great question.
One point to embellish what JD said. So one of the things we're doing is we're building a corpus of Russian language periodicals and newspapers, their discussion on coercion and nuclear cooperation versus natural gas cooperation. And so this is it sounds like you know a lot about data analytics, and what we're doing is, one, trying to build those corpora, which is not easy, but we have, we're talking about, on coercion, we're talking about 25,000, 25,000, document corpus. And then what we're doing is using different machine tools to see if there are different patterns in discourse about nuclear energy and coercion in the Russian periodical and natural gas. to test this argument that the Russians think about nuclear energy like about natural gas. And then you can slice and dice. The nice thing is, once we have this clean corpus, and we can use these tools to see, well, if there's different discourse about this relationship in Moscow versus, let's say, Western Siberia, where where it's closer to natural gas, versus certain areas where it's the hub of nuclear energy. And so to see if there are different stakeholders in this, not only if there are different trends. So you're right on with that. That's what we're trying to do, and to use these tools accordingly, and to map them over the other kind of data that we have here to tell a bigger story.
Thank you, Adam. I don't think I'm muted now. It's obvious that we could go on, much longer. And in fact, we have to move from this kind of public meeting to a follow-on discussion with our colleagues from Georgia Tech in just a few minutes. And, I've been warned by students, faculty, and other administrators that we really conduct meetings for more than 2 hours at our own peril. But I don't see a way around this. So I think we may take a 2 or 3 minute break. I would suggest that at 2 o'clock we kind of resume. I should be the host, and those of you who are supposed to participate know that you're supposed to stay on the line. But at this moment, I would just simply like to express my great appreciation to JD and Adam for really a superb presentation, very, very stimulating. I can tell those of you on the Ms. side that it's our hope and expectation that we will find a means to partner with Georgia Tech in pursuing some aspects of this research, because it's of great interest to the center. And I suspect that we'll have more seminars of this sort on related topics. So please join me in expressing our appreciation, at least virtually, to our two speakers from Georgia Tech.